Thanks. Okay. Welcome, colleagues and everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are based in. So my name is Jingjing Gao, and I'm a researcher at the UNEP DTO Partnership, working in the field of adaptation and transparency. So I also act as the co-chair of this adaptation working group. So on behalf of the working group, I welcome you all to attend this webinar to launch a newly published report on the private sector adaptation reporting in the global Stocktake. So before we start today's session, I'd like to introduce a few rules here. So please kindly mute yourself when you are not talking. You're welcome to keep your camera on if you like. If you have questions or comments during the speeches and the presentations, please use the chat box to leave your questions there. We will have a chance to visit them during the discussion. And also, just for your information, this session will be recorded. Okay, so the adaptation working group of the iGST was created in 2019 with the objective to support the GST by providing a sound assessment of progress made on adaptation in relation to the global goal on adaptation. So today, the working group will present some key findings of our work during 2021 with the focus of integrating private sector's adaptation report to the GST. So now I'd like to introduce you today's agenda. So in the first part, we would like to invite our 4 speakers to give short remarks to set the scene for today's discussion. So each of the speakers will highlight a particular perspective related to this report. For example, the formal GST process, the non-state actors' role in adaptation, the challenges in monitoring adaptation progress, and also private sector's climate action reporting. So in the second part of the today's event, the working group will walk you through the new publication with the key findings and the implication for GST and adaptation transparency on global level. Finally, we will open the floor for questions, comments, and discussion that you have a chance to interact with our panelists, including our speakers and the leading authors of this report. So with that, I would like to invite Jamal Soroji to speak to iGST and its linkage to the formal UNFCCC GST process. Jamal is a climate expert at the World Resource Institute. Welcome you, Jamal.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jingjing. And thank you, Hannah, for sharing the slides. Hello, everyone, and good day to all of those who are listening in. It's a great pleasure to be here, and we're certainly having this conversation at a very timely period, given that we just came out of the COP26 in Glasgow, which kickstarted the process for the global stocktake. So for the purpose of my remarks today, I will be really setting the context and talking briefly about the global stocktake in general. Why is it important, and the role of the non-state actors, in particular, the role of the independent global stocktake community, or otherwise the iGST. If you can go to the next slide. Let's start with the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015, and back then it represented a breakthrough in the global response to climate change, with its goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees C and preferably to 1.5 degrees C, strengthening resilience against climate impacts and aligning financial flows to achieve those goals. Now, the Paris Agreement set the same goals for all countries and asked them all to set their own national plans for addressing climate change. And in a way, to hold these countries accountable, countries agreed to regularly report and review their individual efforts and take stock of their collective efforts towards the goal of the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement, therefore, created a global stocktake process, which is why we are here today. This process is meant to assess the progress that has been made and the gaps remaining to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, and what are the challenges and opportunities for increased ambition. Now, as we've said earlier, we've just came out of the COP26 in Glasgow, which kickstarted the first ever global stocktake process. And this process will go on for the next 2 years. So we're really looking at 2 years ahead up until 2023, where the final outcome of the global stocktake is expected. If we can go to the next slide. Here, I want to talk a little about what's great about this process. The global stocktake really is cross-cutting in nature. It looks at not only mitigation, but also adaptation, finance flows, means of implementation, including technology transfer and capacity needs, in addition to efforts on loss and damage and response measures. Both are very key in addressing the climate crisis. And another key element of the global stocktake is that it is to be conducted in light of equity and the best available science. Now, what would an effective global stocktake accomplish? First, it is meant to set the pace by aiming to stimulate and synchronize policies of different nations. Second, and most importantly, it is meant to drive ambition going forward in the Paris Agreement process. So and it does that by setting global benchmarks and sharing best practices around the different cross-cutting areas that we've mentioned earlier: mitigation, adaptation, finance, loss and damage, equity, and others. So the global stocktake is really meant to be the engine behind driving more ambition from countries going forward. As we know, we are not on track for limiting global warming to 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C. And so this ratchet up mechanism is very much needed. And the global stocktake is at the heart of driving ambition from countries. Now, also very importantly is that the global stocktake provides accountability. It provides guidance and signals to all stakeholders, including non-state actors, businesses, civil society, and others on the kinds of action that is needed to address the climate crisis going forward. As we said earlier, the global stocktake will conclude at COP28 in 2023, so 2 years from now, and the process will be repeated every 5 years thereafter. If we can go to the next slide, I'm not gonna go deep into the details of the technical details of the global stocktake, but I just wanted to provide a general overview of the timeline of what we are expecting going forward. So on the timeline of the global stocktake, it is really, the entire process is designed around 3 key phases. Phase 1, which we see here in blue, it is the information collection and preparation phase. This process has already started at COP26, and it provides opportunity to parties and non-party stakeholders, so not only parties or governments, but also non-party stakeholders, to submit information that is necessary to take stock of the progress towards the Paris Agreement. And these inputs will feed into the phase 2, which we see here in orange, which is the technical assessment period. And this includes a series of in-person dialogues to review all the information received. This will take place between mid-2022 till mid-2023. And then all of these discussions will feed into the last phase, which is shown here in green, which will see the release of the key findings of the global stocktake at the end of 2023 at COP28, which is really the final outcome is again meant to inform countries on updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner their climate actions and support, as well as enhancing international cooperation for climate action in general. So this outcome we'll see at COP28, but again, this process extends for 2 years. To give you a very quick update on where we currently stand with the GST, recently the UNFCCC Secretariat have sent out a call for submissions to the global stocktake to receive inputs and start feeding into the global stocktake process. And these are due in February 2022. So we're really looking at a little more than 2 months ahead. And while the global stocktake is a party-driven process that is led by governments, non-party stakeholders also play a very key and important role. In fact, all parties under the Paris Agreement realized or agreed that input by non-party stakeholders will be very important into the global stocktake in order to make it robust, comprehensive, and inclusive. And indeed, the entire process will only be deemed as effective and credible if the process is inclusive and inclusive of all of those different actors, including non-state actors, and the entire process is also transparent. So we need representation really from across the board here. And this is where the independent global stocktake comes in and plays an important role in contributing to the global stocktake process. If we can go to the next slide. So what is the independent global stocktake? The IG, or otherwise known as the iGST. As you can see on the slide, the iGST is a consortium of civil society actors working together to support the global stocktake process. That's at the core of what the iGST is about, bringing together the independent community to do this, to contribute to the global stocktake process. Now, two ways of thinking about how the iGST does this is first by advocating for a robust global stocktake process and aligning the independent community in ways that would empower countries to take greater climate action. And the other way that it does this is by complementing the formal global stocktake process with independent analysis and actions in ways that would ensure that the global stocktake as a moment would generate the maximum positive impact in addressing the climate crisis. If we can go to the next slide, and here I just wanted to show you a bit more about the structure of the iGST. This consortium of different partners really started about a couple of years ago, and it has a wide range of different actors and organizations involved and participating in the goals of the iGST community. And if we can notice, as very similar to the GST as a whole, the iGST is very inclusive and it's also a transparent process. And it's aiming to bring in as many independent actors as possible. So, and here is a call out for those who are listening in, that more institutions are also welcome to come on board and contribute to the iGST process in helping to create a robust global stocktake process going forward. So very similar to how the GST is organized in the fact that it is cross-cutting, the iGST also has working groups that focuses on mitigation, finance, equity, and the purpose of this conversation today, adaptation. We also have regional hubs in Latin America, for instance. So it's really an organization that is built around the global stocktake and really mirrors how the global stocktake process is. I will stop here, but if interested in learning more about the iGST, please feel free to Google us, email us, and we would truly love to hear from you about opportunities for collaboration to make the GST process robust, comprehensive, and inclusive. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jimo, for giving us a very good overview of the GST process and its components, and also the iGST. So speaking of the non-state actors' role, so I would like to introduce Dr. Anna Orhoff from UNEP DTO Partnership to speak to the background of this working group and the non-state actors' role in adaptation. So Anna has been working in the field in transparency, and she is also the editor of Emission Gap Report 2021, which was just launched before the COP26. Anna, welcome.
Thanks very much, Jingjing, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. And I promise you, I won't talk about the emissions gap report, at least not too much today. It feels quite nice not to talk about the emissions gap after a month of emissions gap talks. But I've been so fortunate to join the iGST adaptation working group work from the beginning. And as Jingjing mentioned earlier, we started this adaptation working group under the iGST back in 2019, where we really started out by looking at what is the role of adaptation in the global stocktake? What type of information would be available to inform the global stocktake on adaptation aspects? And how could an independent input really contribute and add value to the global stocktake process? So I think what we clearly saw also from Jamel's presentation is that now is an important moment in terms of informing the global Stocktake process, as it has just been kicked off for real now. And I also think that what we produced and what we've seen so far illustrates both the relevance of and the need for input on adaptation, which is much less well-defined than the global Stocktake process on mitigation in general. It was interesting to see in Glasgow and in the Glasgow Climate Pact, for instance, the establishment of the 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program to define a new global goal on adaptation, something that this working group and other institutions who'd like to join forces in this area could easily follow up on. I also think that the co-facilitators of adaptation in the global Stocktake process are looking for inputs where it would be very relevant to see how we could contribute to the process and to those inputs. And just turning to the non-state actors aspects, there really hasn't been very much attention to the role of non-state actors in adaptation in general, and not under the UNFCCC negotiations. And it's quite striking as the private non-state actors will play an important role in adaptation. Not only are the private actors the ones who will bear the brunt of the climate risks and feel the impacts of climate change and do so already. There's also quite low awareness amongst non-state actors, both on the climate risks that they're facing and the impacts that they're experiencing, but also on the options to avoid them or minimize them at least. Furthermore, there's a lack of systematic assessments and of tracking of both private sector adaptation actions, but also on low cost and effective means of addressing adaptation in the context of private sector actions. So I've really been looking forward to this webinar personally, and to hearing both on the findings and join the discussions on the findings of the new report that will be presented here. So let me just stop here and hand back to Jingjing and say I'm looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for giving us this overview of this journey of this working group since 2019 and your experience on COP26 about adaptation work. So following Anna's remarks, I'd like to invite Dr. Henry Norfield to speak to adaptation in the global context and the challenges that in monitoring the adaptation. Henry has many years of experience in adaptation transparency. He was also the editor of Adaptation Gap Report 2021. The floor is yours, Henry.
Yes, thank you, Jingjing, and welcome everybody. Really nice to be here at this launch event. And as Shira and Jingjing indicated, I'll just say a few words, introductory words about adaptation in general, and what it means and how that might connect to assessing it in today and in the future in the context of the global Stocktake. And let me just start with a few key messages from this year's Adaptation Gap Report, which is the second one in which the report has been a flagship report for UNEP. And basically the core message is that we have some progress in adaptation to addressing the climate risks, but in general, that the progress that we're making in planning, in finance, and in implementation of these actions is still lacking behind. And in some areas, we can actually identify that the gap between what is necessary and what is being done is widening. In particular, in the area of finance, there is a wide gap, and we need to make sure to enhance ambition in order for this gap not to continue widening. And in areas of, while there's more planning, going on. We still don't know how this planning is being implemented and what the results of these actions are. And this already talks a little bit about the challenges we face when it comes to assessing adaptation in the face of growing climate risks. So what is climate risk? As we define it, climate risk is essentially a function of vulnerability or sensitivity and exposure to climate hazards. So we have two basic elements here, the exposure element and then the vulnerability or sensitivity element that we need to address in order to say something about climate risk, which is changing over time. So, and space, different places experience different climate risks. And then we know that adaptation is able to reduce this climate risk significantly, but of course there is a remaining risk, which will then we will be experiencing in the form of impacts and the losses and damages that result from climate change. So in this framework, we have a real challenge in identifying exposure, vulnerability, and then therefore adaptation as the means through which to reduce these climate risks at the global level. And when it comes to aggregating the information from the local level where the impacts are taking place to national levels where they're being aggregated and reported in the context of the global stocktake, and that will take place every 5 years, it's really critical that we find the right metrics through which we can do that. And we have some information about quantitative metrics that we can measure, you know, the numbers of actions that we're doing, the numbers of plans that is happening, the amount of money that is going into adaptation, and we can aggregate that from the national levels and report it, but it doesn't help us really actually say something about the change in climate risk. So we need individually calibrated indicators, metrics that help us say something about how that risk is changing at specific places over time, and how to then aggregate it to higher levels that can be communicated while not losing too much of the information in the process. So this is a really, really challenging thing and much more complicated than, for instance, in mitigation, where you have one central metric. And there is no real answer at this point, and certainly it takes a lot of time to unpack what is necessary to be tracked. There's just, I think, a few principles that we should be considering here, and after which I will stop. First of all, I think it's absolutely necessary that the metrics that we identify as relevant can be aggregated. That is, that they are measurable from the local to the national and then global scales. And ideally, these metrics are actually the same from the lowest to the highest level. For instance, the GSP is a really strong indicator of people's vulnerability to climate hazards, because the less money they have, the more vulnerable they are to potentially to the climate impacts. And therefore, if we can measure those indicators across scales, it's possible to aggregate things much easier. Exposure is also possible to measure by where people live and if they are exposed, and things like that can be done. Then the second point is that these indicators, metrics, can be repeatedly measured over time so that we can see a trend happening across the time as we progress in multiple iterations of the global stocktake, and then can see how things are changing. And that helps us understand whether or not we're making progress on adaptation in the context of the global stocktake. And finally, of course, these metrics need to be feasible. So it's, there are elements of burden for, in particular, developing countries. And we need to make sure that the metrics that we are identifying are indeed measurable to the countries and at the ground level. So these are just some initiating thoughts, which hopefully will also enrich the discussion that you will have when preparing your presentation on non-state actors in the context of the independent global stocktake, which will then inform, I believe, the official global stocktake. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thanks a lot, Harry, for pointing out the key challenges in currently the adaptation measurement, and point out a few potential direction to solve these challenges. And I believe in that sense, the iGST as a science-based community can play a key role here. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce David Carlin, who leads the climate risk program at UNEP Finance Initiative, to speak to the private sector's reporting on climate action. David, please.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and it's been terrific to be a part of such a diverse community as we've worked on this global stocktake. And I think it's really a testament to how cross-cutting and essential this issue is, that we think about it in the context of different parts of the world, different drivers of challenges, and different parts of global society, from governments to NGOs to the private sector. And in my capacity leading UNEP FI's climate risk work, a lot of the focus that we've done is working directly with some of those private sector institutions and private sector companies on specifically the ways in which they report on climate and climate-related risks. And so one of the big standards that has been developed, first in the private sector, was the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which suggests 11 different disclosures on climate risks and opportunities to try to give a holistic picture of how firms are addressing climate change and also preparing for the impacts. Increasingly, focuses have been on alignment and on decarbonization. So I've also supported the work of the GFANZ initiative and helping them to move toward decarbonization of the global financial sector and making that change occur through the real economy. In addition, we saw a lot of discussion in Glasgow of the movement toward greater mitigation efforts. So the phasing down, obviously people wanted more ambition than that, but the reference to fossil fuels and the reference to coal for the first time in a report and in a communique from COP. But I would say one of the big things that remains somewhat challenging and somewhat overlooked is private sector reporting on adaptation. And both this is in terms of the financing commitments. We saw at COP a number of adaptation commitments, but once again, according to the UNFCCC, the $100 billion of funding for the developing world still has not been met. The goal is now to grow that amount, but recognizing from UNEP's own adaptation gap report that the scale of the gap may be hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in the coming years, especially in places that are least able to pay, really makes resilience a matter of life or death, and really of economic sustainability as well. And so it becomes increasingly incumbent for private sector institutions, not just to report on the physical risks they're exposed to, but what are the active steps they are taking, both to promote resiliency in communities, but also to provide financing that will support adaptation efforts. And so this has been a topic that we as UNEP FI are increasingly taking up. Myself and a colleague leading a program of FIs to explore that and to improve the expectations around reporting. And it's our strong hope that in the coming year, adaptation can be as central as mitigation and as alignment have become, which has been really wonderful to see those go mainstream. But we also recognize that this isn't a future challenge, but a current challenge. And that means that adaptation can't be just something that is planned, but something that is actually actively taking place. And understanding where firms are on that process is going to be particularly important to do not only a comparison of who is playing their part, but also where there are potential vulnerabilities and limits in the existing structure of resiliency. So all of that to say, I think the private sector has a tremendously important role to play, and we need more from them, both in terms of creative financing vehicles, in terms of innovation, in terms of awareness of this, and directing those flows into the right parts of the world that most need this in order to build those resilient communities. But even in the developed world, this focus on resiliency is a critical one. We saw it in the US with Hurricane Sandy, we saw it with Hurricane Katrina, we saw with the flooding this year in Germany, that there is still a major need in all communities to really think about this. So while there is both an urgent imperative to work in emerging economies, this is a global issue, and it means that the global responsibility and expectation on the private sector exists all across the world, and through better disclosure, but also greater commitment to these things, moving toward a commitment-based model and moving toward expectations of adaptation that fall along similar lines to the ones that we've seen for mitigation and alignment, I think is really the next step forward, and the one that I hope to see us take in 2022.
Thank you so much, David, and for sharing us this overview, a picture of private sector's engagement in adaptation. And we do look forward that private sector's adaptation becoming more visible in the coming years. And so now I would like to move to the next part, that to invite our lead authors, two of our lead authors, to walk you through this new publication with the key findings. So Dr. Vedi Avisha from India Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, will provide an overview of this study, looking into the rationales behind and the approach the study took, together with which Vedi will also present some of the empirical work that we have done in relation to corporate disclosure, who will be followed by Thomas Dale from UNEP DTO Partnership, walk you through the rest of this report, including the private sector's reporting pathways to GST and the gaps and the recommendations for GST better considering those data. Vedi, please.
Thank you, and good day, everyone. Thanks for joining this launch for our paper on private sector reporting as a source of input.
Hey, Vidi, sorry to interrupt. I think we're seeing the wrong display. Could you flip? That's, yeah, thank you. Looks great.
Great. So again, sorry. So yeah, I am Vidi, one of the co-chairs for this working group, and this report has been co-authored with our co-chair at UNEP DTO Partnership. The next slide, please. So let's quickly then get into introducing this work. Next slide, please. Yeah. At the cost of repeating myself and what has been talked about since past 40 minutes almost, the first Stocktake is here, and what this report does is to inform the information collection and preparation, as well as the technical assessment phases of the first Stocktake. That is where our scope of work lies for the 2021 work program. Next slide, please. So first of all, why private sector reporting on adaptation? Firstly, private sector is a part of economy that is run by individuals and companies and is not state controlled. And if you look at the global GDP, which is around $90 trillion per year, roughly top 6,000 firms employ 93 million people and have a market cap worth of $95 trillion, right? Which is, a little more than the overall GDP globally. Again, all the revenues that these firms turn in, which is around $39 trillion forms almost 45% of the global GDP. So a huge sector from the point of view of employment and other implications to the wider society. And we do know that climate change is already affecting these businesses. Just a little more information on what kind of businesses. So it's not just in the global north. The 17 of the top 100 firms are in developing countries. And although the developing countries have a higher share of public sector companies, a lot of them are under transition to privatization. And hence they would in future form a part of this larger kitty of stakeholders that would be very crucial in order to implement the mitigation and adaptation actions. And hence, if we miss the actions that these firms are taking into informing the global stocktake, we may be actually limiting the purpose of what the global stocktake would be doing into informing the parties in the negotiations. Also, something we noticed is that one of the primary inputs to the UNFCCC's formal stocktake would be country reports. And information on private sector actions, specifically in adaptation, has largely been missing from these party submissions. Also, there are very few discussions on integrating these actions into the stocktake. And there has been very little progress on discussions and approaches to tracking and assessing such activities at a global level. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, we decided to look at approaches for effectively linking private sector climate risk management and adaptation into the stocktake through investigating a couple of emerging data sources, for example, the private sector reporting. And then based on this, we tried to formulate certain recommendations to enhance this data set as a robust input to the formal stocktake. Next slide, please. So we started with a conceptual framework and then took two different assessments here, looking and mapping, assessing of private sector reporting process relevant to the adaptation through literature review and case studies. And we also looked into reviewing the agreed modalities of the stocktake through literature review. This led us to identifying gaps and developing outlooks and recommendations for integrating the actions from private sector adaptation into the global stocktake. Through this entire process, we were facilitated by an expert group, and we held a few discussions with the group at every stage, along with the group providing us enough reviews to make the entire document a lot more robust. This group consisted of 12 experts with their interests in either private sector adaptation or climate-related disclosures or the formal stocktake process. Next slide, please. So to be considered by the stocktake, data from the private sector reporting will need to be aggregated from the company level information to the global level, where it could be then considered as a source of input. Thus, we started with identifying possible information path flows here as to how these aggregations could happen and through which types of reporting these aggregations could happen. So if you look at this framework that we've put out here, companies would either report via climate-related corporate disclosures or report to databases that document non-state climate action, or they would be reporting to national governments. Now, these three types of reportings we'll get a little more in detail through the presentation. Looking at what is happening with reporting via climate-related corporate disclosures. So once these disclosures happen at a company level, there could be analysis by third parties at various levels of aggregation, which could then flow into global stocktake. So these aggregations could be at a subnational level, a national level, regional or global. And then once these aggregations happen at a global level, it could be used as an input to the stocktake. The second option that the flow that this would have would be the analysis at national level, could be taken up by governments and then fed into the stocktake through national submissions, right? The other reporting option or type is looking into reporting to databases that document non-state climate actions. Again, here the flow would go through various levels of aggregation, either by third-party analysis or through third-party activities. And then reporting to national governments could directly feed into the stocktake, or then further could be aggregated at regional or global level and then feed into the stocktake process. So these are the aggregation pathways, as well as the types of reporting options that we identified to start with. And then we go further to understand what's happening actually and how they turn out to be. Next slide, please. So here, now we look a little more into detail on reporting via climate-related corporate disclosures. Next slide, please. So what are we looking at here? So during the initial years of 21st century, the environment, social, and governance-related disclosures started becoming really popular. And around 2015, the Financial Stability Board formulated the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which added the momentum to this entire movement. This task force released a recommendation in 2017 that emphasized the need for companies to frame climate change or identify climate change as an essential business risk. And based on these recommendations, several firms started actually reporting what they were doing and what are the risks they were facing. There were several other initiatives that also evolved over time that were looking into either disclosure frameworks or they were standard setting organizations that helped into the entire reporting and disclosure process for the firms. Next slide, please. So what do they generate here? As far as adaptation-related data is concerned, these companies could predominantly be using three different ways of disclosing their information. It could be through their annual reports or other periodic financial and non-financial filings. It could be standalone sustainability reports, or it could be response to CDP climate questionnaires. Essentially, two types of risk, that is transition and physical risks, get reported as far as adaptation-related information is concerned. There's a little more of disclosure that's happening on physical and the physical risks, acute as well as chronic, whereas the transition risks that get reported are more on the mitigation-related policy and legal changes. So we're not really seeing a lot of transition risks on adaptation that have been coming up. Next slide, please. So if you look at the characteristics of this data, overall, these disclosures are increasing in number as well as in quality, ensuring that there's comparability across these disclosures. All the frameworks and standards that I mentioned earlier have also been talking to each other to ensure that there is alignment with TCFD and there is alignment within them. So that is something good that's happening. And we do see that maybe in future, there would be a lot more consistent and efficient disclosures coming out. However, currently there is a bit of comprehensiveness concern because there is uneven disclosures around different themes. So certain themes get much more disclosed, whereas the other indicators don't get disclosed so much. Again, there's inconsistencies across geography and sector. So we predominantly find European firms to be disclosing more compared to the global south. If we look at sectors, insurance discloses a lot more on risk management and mitigation actions versus energy that predominantly discloses a little more on transition risks and mitigation requirements. We also see that MNCs and SMEs are two different set of industries that behave very differently. So larger firms tend to disclose a lot more than the smaller firms. Again, when we look at these disclosures, we do find that not all the types of adaptation actions are captured. For example, when we looked at Indian Railways case for this report, we did find that certain actions are being reported as business as usual mitigation versus adaptation related risk mitigation. So it also depends on the firm as to how they want to go about it. Next slide, please. Okay, there is some aggregation happening for this data through various reports and studies, and they summarize what's happening. These are good to provide insights for comprehensive reporting, as well as provide some sensitivity into what is lacking when such information is used as an input to the GST. So how these things vary across sector, geography, and region could be reflected through these summaries. I would now request Thomas to take us through the other two reporting types, as well as the rest of the report, the recommendations, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vidhi. So yeah, as Vidhi said, I will be taking you through the rest of the presentation. So without further ado, moving on to the next type of private sector reporting process that we've identified, which is reporting to databases documenting non-state climate action. So what are we referring to here? When we talk about databases documenting non-state climate action, what we are referring to is publicly accessible platforms that host databases of climate action being implemented by non-state actors. So over the past 10, 15 years or so, there's been a growing number of such platforms being set up by various actors as a means of consolidating and or tracking different types of climate action by different types of actors. Now, as the data collected by these platforms can often be accessed online and freely, these databases can be used by third parties as a data source for assessing climate action. And given our objectives, we were interested in exploring to what extent these databases could represent a data source for assessing private sector adaptation. And overall, we identified 4 different databases as being relevant for this purpose. And these were the Global Climate Action Portal, which was formerly known as NASCA and has been set up by the UNEP and serves as a tracking vehicle for the Marrakech work program. It also includes the Private Sector Initiative, which has a private sector adaptation database. This was also set up by the UNEP and was created under the Nairobi work program. The Cooperative Climate Initiative database, which is operated by a coalition of research organizations and hosted by the Global Center on Adaptation. And finally, the Climate Initiatives platform, which is operated by some of our colleagues here at UNEP DTU Partnership. In terms of how these databases generate adaptation-relevant information, information about adaptation is either, or it's collected on these databases by either being collected and uploaded by the platform's operators, or else it's submitted to the platform by implementing organizations hoping to gain exposure or contribute their knowledge to international movements. Now, between them, the 4 databases identified collect data about private sector occurring on two separate levels. So the first of these is at the company level, by which I mean adaptation being implemented generally unilaterally by a single company. And we also see that these databases also document information on adaptation occurring at the cooperative level. So adaptation being implemented by coalitions of different stakeholders via cooperative initiatives. Now, across the 4 different databases, they have different focuses. For example, the Private Sector Initiatives database largely focuses on adaptations being implemented by single companies. Meanwhile, the Cooperative Climate Initiative database and the Climate Initiative platform exclusively document cooperative initiatives. Meanwhile, the Global Climate Action platform, or platform which theoretically documents both types of adaptation. So concerning the characteristics of this data, in general, we found that the data sets provided by these databases are not particularly useful for the purposes of assessing progress in private sector adaptation. Now the reasons for this vary between databases. However, the biggest issue across all four of them is probably the fact that the number of entries that these databases have that are relevant to private sector adaptation are generally too small to be robust or representative at the global level. And just to put this into perspective, the largest database, which is found on the Private Sector Initiatives database, only contains 103 relevant entries. Now, aside from issues relating to the quantity of data points, there are other issues with using these databases as a source of data. And other common issues that have negative implications for the usability of these databases include the fact that information stored on these databases is largely ex ante and not necessarily updated regularly. And what this means is that it can't really provide information about progress and results achieved by these actions. A notable exception to this is the Global Climate Action Portal, which was relaunched following COP22, and it now has enabled people submitting actions to it to update them, and they've done this with the explicit purpose of documenting progress. Also, consistency between entries on these databases is limited, and namely this means that there's a significant variation in the depth and the format of information provided across data points, and this makes comparison and ultimately aggregation quite difficult. Further, the reliability of information on these databases can be questionable, and also probably a more minor point, but the usability of these databases is also generally not great. And in terms of whether or not this information is already being used at aggregated levels, in our work to develop this report, we found that information stored on these databases has been used in a number of assessments for tracking non-state climate action, including some that track private sector actors. However, as was previously mentioned by Anna, and probably reflecting the limitations we've just outlined about adaptation-related data, none of these assessments actually look at private sector adaptation. And instead, those that do focus on private sector climate action are generally limited to tracking mitigation actions. In fact, the closest we come to using this data to investigate private sector adaptation appears to be taking place in a handful of studies that either are using case studies of private sector adaptation action to generate insights about the private sector's perception of climate change adaptation, and also to develop a greater understanding of how private sector adaptation can manifest itself in practice. And there's also some studies that assess the landscape of cooperative climate initiatives to develop an understanding of potential impact and to identify gaps and needs in the cooperative initiative landscape. But none of these really track progress over time, which would be the aim, I guess, to inform the global stocktake. Also, moving on to the last type of private sector reporting we've identified, this is reporting to national governments. So again, what are we referring to here? So in the context of this presentation, reporting to national governments is referring to processes in which national governments are asking companies within their jurisdictions to provide them with information about how they are exposed to and are adapting to climate change. Now, while there's no one reason why a government would ask companies to report on adaptation in this manner, a likely motivation would be that they would want to collect and analyze this information in order to inform the development of policy interventions. And while this is the case, once collected, information about adaptation in their own domestic private sectors could be included by national governments within their national submissions to the UNFCCC. So I'm talking about national communications and maybe voluntary submissions to the global stocktake. And this would then provide quite a low-cost way of placing this information in a location where it could at least be reviewed by the global stocktake, if not considered in its final outputs. So looking at how governments could actually collect this information, so in the report, we identified two broad approaches national governments could take to collect information from their domestic private sectors. The first is to establish bespoke reporting systems, in other words, mechanisms and processes for collecting information directly from companies. And the second is to utilize data already being generated by climate-related corporate disclosures and use this as a secondary source of data. Now, the advantage of going for the former would be that government end users of this data would have greater control over the information that companies are providing to them. However, establishing such systems would require fairly significant resources, which might make it unviable or undesirable for certain countries to implement. Utilizing data already being generated by climate-related corporate disclosures, however, would clearly require less resources. And this would particularly be the case when governments are already collecting this information, as they would presumably be if they had made climate-related corporate disclosure a legal requirement. However, government end users will then lose control over which companies are disclosing and the precise scope of information being reported. So in other words, they would have to work with whatever information they had. And now moving on to the question about whether countries are actually collecting and analyzing data about private sector adaptation, a short answer to this question is that there are currently very few examples of national governments doing this. And in fact, during our work in preparing this report, we were only really able to find one case of a national government establishing a reporting system of this kind. Now, the government in question is the UK government, who are obliged to periodically ask companies that are considered to be of strategic importance to the country's resilience to report to it regarding how they are adapting to climate change. And now the purpose of doing this is to inform the development of the country's periodic climate change risk assessment and its national adaptation program. So again, this is going back to the idea that these systems can be used to inform policy interventions. Now, the system established by the UK government, which is known as the Adaptation Reporting Power, asks companies to develop detailed reports regarding how they are exposed to climate change and what they're doing to adapt to climate impacts. So essentially, it's asking companies to develop full and very, very detailed climate-related corporate disclosures, albeit ones that are focusing purely on the exposure to and management of physical climate risks. So it's not interested in transition risks, for example. And while the generation of this highly detailed information is useful, this process is quite heavy and is definitely resource intensive for both the government and reporting companies. And this might make it unviable for replication in many other countries. However, it's not the only approach that could be taken to collecting and analyzing private sector adaptation at the national level. So in another example that we assessed, a national level assessment conducted in Chile, this time not by a national government, but by a non-state actor, takes a much lighter approach and instead relies on companies to complete a survey and in some cases follow up using semi-structured interviews. Now, while being much lighter, this approach can still provide important insights into the prevailing perceptions of climate risk, vulnerability and preparedness amongst private sector actors, which could then be used to develop policy interventions. And what's more interesting about this case is that the results of the survey were actually integrated by Chile's government into their fourth national communication to the UNFCCC, which can act as an example of how this information can make the jump from internal government exercise to being in a place where it could actually be considered by the global stocktake.
Sorry, Thomas, sorry to interrupt you, but since we are a little bit behind the schedule, it will be great if you can make the rest a little bit shorter. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jingjing. I will do this as quickly as I can. So maybe just to rush this slide then, the second option that we talked about, which was utilizing data generated by climate-related corporate disclosures, which would represent a lighter version of establishing a bespoke system. This at the moment, there's not. We haven't found any evidence of governments doing this, but this isn't necessarily because the idea is either unworkable or not interesting, but it's possibly more due to the fact that climate-related corporate disclosures are still pretty young as a concept. So it's only been a possibility for a few years now. And secondly, for these systems to work in practice, it will probably need governments to make climate-related disclosure mandatory in order to ensure that companies are actually disclosing to a high enough standard that these disclosures are useful. Okay, so moving on to where this leaves us. To summarize where this leaves us, as covered by my colleague Vidhi earlier, in order to be able to be considered by the global stocktake, information generated by private sector reporting needs to be aggregated from the company level to the global level, where it can then be considered as a source of input and included in the global stocktake's technical assessment. However, based on the exploration of the current reporting landscape, the potential for this to happen is likely going to be limited by gaps in two areas. So the first area is the data itself, and as we've just covered, this data is presently limited in various ways. However, across all types of reporting, the key issues seem to be similar. So the first of these is the fact that most of these forms of reporting aren't generating enough data to be robust. A possible exception to this is climate-related corporate disclosures, as they're generating thousands of things annually. The second issue is that comparability, comprehensiveness, and general quality of reporting is questionable at the moment, and this is going to impact on our ability to meaningfully aggregate this data. And the final issue is that reporting processes are not really collecting data that's globally representative, and particularly representative across different dimensions of the private sector. So as Vidhi mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of this is concentrated on actors based in the global north, and also concentrated in large enterprises and not SMEs. The second area relates to the lack of linkages between the company level data and the global stocktake itself. So while data is being generated by private sector reporting, and in some cases it is being aggregated, at the moment the ways in which it's being aggregated actually has limited relevance to tracking progress in private sector adaptation. And just for example, large-scale assessments of climate-related corporate disclosures, including those using CDP data, at the moment are either assessing progress in mitigation action, or more commonly, they're assessing progress in the extent to which disclosures are aligned with the TCFD recommendations. So basically, they're not looking at adaptation, they're more looking at disclosure practice. And in addition to the absence of suitable linkages, connecting company level data, in addition to the absence of suitable linkages connecting company level data to the global stocktake, it's actually, under the current proposals concerning how the global stocktake will be conducted, it's actually unclear to what extent information about private sector adaptation could, in practice, be considered by the global stocktake. And I say this, for example, because while the modalities of the global stocktake agreed in Decision 19 CMA1 at COP 2024 take nothing off the table in terms of relevant themes that can be explored by the global stocktake, it actually remains to be seen whether the global stocktake will be able to prioritize private sector adaptation alongside a host of other competing themes that are possibly more prominent under the convention. And some examples of this could be those mentioned by Jamal earlier, loss and damage, finance, and others. So given where we are now, what could be the next steps? So of the three types of reporting reviewed, it essentially seems that climate-related corporate disclosure represents the most promising source of input for assessing private sector adaptation. Now, the primary reason for this is that despite current limitations in their quality, climate-related corporate disclosures, they're the only source of data that's generating large quantities of data on an annual basis and have global coverage, even if this coverage is imbalanced. Further, because of the movements to align behind the TCFD recommendations and building experience at the collective level, the data generated through this process will become more comprehensive and comparable, meaning that their potential to be meaningfully aggregated over time is going to increase. It's worth saying, though, that certain limitations, such as the inherent reporting bias caused by the realities of preparing disclosures that favor large companies and companies in certain regions, are probably not going to be overcome fully. But in light of the current limitations, initial approaches for using climate-related corporate disclosures as an input for assessing private sector adaptation, these could focus on tracking process indicators associated with implementing widely applicable best practices. So such actions could take a starting point by looking at the TCFD recommendations and the kinds of actions that they promote. For example, they could track the amount of companies establishing governance structures related to climate risks, the amount of companies conducting scenario analyses that include physical climate risks in the assessment, the amount of companies that have integrated physical climate risks into their broader risk assessment processes, and also the amount of companies that have developed an adaptation plan, amongst others. Now, while this approach would not necessarily enable assessments to determine if companies are reducing their vulnerability to climate change, which, as Henry mentioned earlier, would be the ultimate aim of these assessments, what it would do is it would provide an indication of whether companies are establishing the necessary processes and governance structures to increase their adaptive capacity. And what this does really is it represents a start, and it would represent a clear improvement on what is available now. Okay, so based on the work we've done, we've devised 6 broad recommendations that we believe could improve the present situation. The first 3 recommendations relate to the steps needed to improve the usability of data presently being reported. And so, our first recommendation is that we believe that key actors in the corporate disclosure arena need to place greater focus on building the capacity of companies to report on physical risks and their management. And I think this echoes something that David said earlier in his presentation. At the moment, most of the focus is on mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions, and we need that to change if the quality of adaptation reporting is going to improve. Secondly, national governments can also play an important role in this by essentially mandating climate-related corporate disclosures within their jurisdictions. Okay, and finally, of all the available databases that we covered that track non-state climate action, due to its linkages with various aspects of the UNFCCC process, the Global Climate Action Portal could represent an important player in tracking private sector adaptation. However, if it wants to do this, it really needs to increase the extent to which it captures adaptation implemented by the private sector, because at the moment, it doesn't capture any cases of individual companies implementing adaptation unilaterally, despite the fact it does for cities, and it also does the same for companies when they're implementing mitigation actions. And finally, the last 3 recommendations are aimed at bridging the gap between the outputs of private sector reporting and the global stocktake. And we make the following recommendations. So firstly, if this gap is to be bridged, the research community needs to start developing and implementing approaches for tracking and assessing progress in private sector adaptation at the global level. Now, this process is likely to take time. However, as we're essentially starting from zero, this desperately needs to happen if information is going to be aggregated upwards in a manner that can meaningfully inform the global stocktake. And actually, maybe such actors from the research community could take a starting point in looking at the large-scale assessments of corporate disclosures that assess how well they're aligned with the TCFD, because these already have developed certain approaches, which means they're able to assess thousands of corporate disclosures and pull out key findings from these. Secondly, we think national governments should or can start tracking and assessing adaptation in their domestic private sectors through either establishing systems to do this or utilizing existing corporate disclosures. And further, if they do this, they should strive to include key results of these assessments in their submissions to the UNFCCC, thereby ensuring that this information is at least reviewed by the global stocktake. And finally, the global stocktake itself should ensure it remains open to including information about progress in private sector adaptation if and when resources become available. Okay, thanks a lot, and I will hand back over to Jingjing.
Thank you, Thomas and Vedi, for walking us through this report. And before we shift to the discussion session, so let me just introduce you our panelists today. Besides our 4 speakers and Dr. Vedi and Thomas, who just presented this report, we also have other authors of the report, Professor Amit Garg from India Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Susanna Conrad and myself from UNEP DTO Partnership. So I'm really sorry for that we are a little bit behind the schedule. So let's just pick some questions from the audience. I can see there are a lot of questions, but one of them I think is really relevant. Maybe we can pick up from there. It's a question from Christina Chan. She asks, can you also distinguish between what companies are doing to adapt their companies to climate change versus that what companies are doing to advance adaptation technologies? I think this is a very interesting topic that we have also tried to cover in our report. Maybe Professor Amit or Thomas, I don't know whether any of you can start from here.
Yeah. This is a very important question. Thank you very much for putting it up, because companies normally take action for their own impact reduction and maybe managing their risks. So that is personal individual adaptation actions. But what you are referring to is adaptation technology development, adaptation practices which could be used by others. And this is, I think, something which is very, very imperative and important now, because the risks are increasing in every sector, every location. So if a company develops something in maybe country A, it may be deployed in other countries by other companies and maybe also by public sector. So I think the positive externality or usage of such an initiative will be much more than what the company could think. So I think both are important. I completely agree. Governing structures, adaptation practices, adaptation technologies, and their own adaptation actions. So it may start with a very, very personal individual focus, but the repercussions could be very, very broad. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amit. I don't know whether Thomas, you want to add more to this question?
My sound cut out just as the question was being asked, so I'm actually not sure what it is.
Sorry, it is a question about whether the companies are doing to adapt their companies to climate change versus that what companies are doing to advance adaptation technologies. So basically, the 2 types of contribution to adaptation by companies.
Yeah, but in what sense? In terms of what they're disclosing, or the value
whether
of
you
tracking?
can distinguish them in terms of in the reporting. That is my understanding.
Yeah, I think the first so what companies are doing to climate proof themselves will probably be easier to track, at least in the short term, simply because of the progress being made by the TCFD, which focuses on enterprise risk. So what's at risk to the company making, being able to operate and make profit. And I think, for these, it would be easier to develop standardized indicators of types of adaptation action that they could be disclosing on, and then could be picked up using artificial intelligence and sort of tracked over time and how these numbers change. In terms of how companies are contributing to societal adaptation, I think this will be more difficult to track because it can vary a lot, I think. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like the sort of standardized, it doesn't seem like there's so much convergence on how to report on this and how to report on progress and how to quantify the size of the action and results. So I think this, it's not that it can't be done, but I think it will be more challenging.
Thanks for that, Thomas. And since we are a little bit over time, so if I can just beg all of you to stay here another few minutes, then we can pick another question. We do have another very interesting question from Lucy in Ghana. She asked, to what extent are these databases likely to capture the effectiveness of adaptation? So which means more critical assessment of the outcomes of actions, as opposite to only report on what the actors are doing. I think this is also one of the elements that this reporter pays attention to. I don't know whether Thomas or Vidi or Professor Ahmed or Susanna, any of you want to start?
Yeah, I think we looked at certain sectors, so maybe Vidhi could provide more details on that.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Garg. We looked at some of the reporting that's happening actually across a few sectors. We looked at agriculture and food, what's happening with energy, utilities, renewable energy, as well as transport and other infrastructure. And we do find that a lot of what gets reported is mitigation, very little on adaptation, again, a lot of physical risks that get identified, not much. And to answer to what Christina also had mentioned, this connects here, that a lot of adaptation actions that they mentioned are more like what's happening with their enterprise risk management tool. They're including climate risks there, the actions like, if it's a agriculture firm, they've talked about water resilient crops or for the crop management exercises, etc. But then how they're not tracking as to what has been the outcome. These actions are more of a planning stage actions for now that we could understand from the way they have reported it. But it doesn't track as to how effective some of these have been. So we don't know how the outcomes would look like. Again, when they mention technologies like developing water resilient crops, for example, then again, there's not much of description of what's happening. Is the technology available for others to use, etc. So that's what we realized. So again, a lot of gaps in what is being reported as far as outcomes on adaptation actions is concerned. Thank you. Thomas, would you like to add something?
Maybe just going back to Lucy's question. It depends, I guess, also what databases we're talking about. Now, if we're talking about disclosures, then what Vidhi's just said is relevant. But if we're also talking about the online databases that we covered, so the Global Climate Action Portal, etc. I mean, to what extent are they likely to capture effectiveness is quite a tough question. At the moment, they don't particularly capture effectiveness of adaptation because on the public portals they don't have any. They tend not to have updates of progress. Now the Global Climate Action Portal has started doing this, and I can see in the chat that Sander Chan, who is one of the key brains behind the cooperative climate initiatives database, has also mentioned that while the public portal doesn't have ex post information, they actually do have this internally, I believe, from what he's saying. But yeah, I think at the moment that the capturing of results needs to improve on these platforms if they're going to be able to be used for assessing sort of progress and results going forwards. And yeah, I don't know. Sorry, it's I think it's at the moment, these platforms also, they need to sort of develop a sort of a more coherent framework as to how they collect these information concerning effectiveness and results as well, because at the moment, even when they do have this information, it's also very hard to compare between different actions or I mean, mainly cooperative initiatives. So before we can work with this information, there needs to be greater convergence, basically. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Thomas and Vedi. Maybe we can just have the very last question before we close the discussion session. So this is very interesting. Maybe it's more for discussion. It's from Robert K. He mentioned that in his experience, the private sector businesses group can be important intermediaries between individual businesses and the national government reporting, and whether this can give any insight to our work. I think I would like to invite David to say something regarding this.
Sure. 1 second.
At the meantime, if any other speakers or our authors would like to respond to this comment, please just join.
Sorry. Was just having trouble with the background noise. So I think that there's a really important connection between the private sector and governmental reporting. And I think we saw this a lot at COP with the commitments on net zero, in the sense of seeing the private sector aim to push governments to move more quickly and assertively. And I think in some ways, the private sector in the creation of the TCFD very much tried to define a set of standards, which then have been picked up and adopted by institutions, governmental institutions. So I think that building of convergence and that expectation of standards, as well as things like data and good practices, I think that really can come from collaborative work between the private sector and government. So I definitely see that as an area here, and one that's so important, especially when we're talking about potential for things like blended finance and the need for private and public dollars to flow into to projects.
Thank you, David. And I can see we have really a lot of very good questions. We wish that we have more time that we can discuss with you more in details. However, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I apologize again. But I think now our report is available online. You're very welcome to download that. And the link will be shared with you shortly in the chat box. And you have all our contact information there. We are very welcome you to have more comments or questions that we can have more detailed discussion with you. And by saying that, I'd like to thank the speakers for their remarks today and our adaptation working group of panelists for their presentation and the discussions. I actually also want to use this chance to thank our working group expert who contributed to this report, as well as the external reviewers for their comments and suggestions. And lastly, I want to thank the audience for all your engagement today. Sorry again for the delay, but I hope that we have had a good discussion, and we really look forward that our report that can be shared within your the network and can support your work in a way. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks so much, Jingjing.
There are technical problem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jingjing. Thanks all.
Thank you very much. Great.
But
Really
there are
great.
technical problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.